the public service announcements that exist about that practice, did you also know that it's dangerous to text while walking? This video compilation will demonstrate for us. Hopefully you have been none of those people. You see, the problem with texting and doing anything else is that while we are texting, our view is so minimized to just that small screen right in front of our eyes. And so we can't see the panoramic vision of everything else that's going on around us. Maybe that's a microcosm of a problem that we encounter in life. Maybe we are so distracted by lesser things that we are unable to see the big picture. Do you ever struggle with that, one area of life or another? Are you so engrossed in what is right in front of you that you can't see beyond it? We have an old saying about that. It says, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? You're so focused on one or two trees, you don't realize there's an entire forest in front of you. Maybe, for example, you spend so much money enjoying life right now that you've not made the kind of investments you need to make for the future. Maybe, for instance, you've never been able to purchase a house because you're spending your money on other things. Maybe you've never disciplined yourself to do without so that you can plan for your financial future. You have no investments. You have no retirement plan. I spoke with a man in his late 40s recently who was in that predicament. He and his wife were making over $100,000 a year, but they spend their money freely. They eat out all the time. They buy whatever catches their eye. They spend money buying things online, keeping Amazon in business, but they don't own a home. They have no retirement account. They are so absorbed in enjoying the right now that they aren't focused on the big picture, and it will haunt them someday. This morning we're going to learn from a group of people of faith who were focused on the big picture. They were able to see down the road of faith to where they were going. And they taught us to focus on our destination while we are on this journey. Our sermon text comes from Hebrews 11. You may know that that is called the faith chapter of the Bible, for it uses the phrase by faith 22 times in that chapter. In that chapter, we are introduced to 15 heroes of faith by name, and several others are anonymously referred to. Verse 13 of that chapter tells us about all of them. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They were able to see down the road they were traveling. They were able to see the destination they were going to. They lived by faith through great difficulties. They walked that road of faith consistently because they were able to look ahead and see where they were going. That concept of looking ahead to see where you were going is also repeated often in Hebrews chapter 11. Let's go back to verse 13, or at least part of it again. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. These people, these heroes of faith, had a faith that gave them a vision of their future, that enabled them to see the destination at the end of life's journey, and it also gave them the strength to endure the journey along the way. Now let's go back to that verse one more time and read it in its immediate context. Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 16. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they left, they would have opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. That idea of looking ahead, looking down the road, seeing where you were going, it was spoken of in this chapter of Noah, as we see in verse 7. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. He was able to see what was not visible to the typical human eye because he was looking down the road in faith. That concept is also attributed to Abraham, as we see in verse 8 of this chapter. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. He was able to look down the road, trust God along the journey, not knowing where God was leading him, but he trusted God so much that he left behind a life of security and wealth. He left his family to go to another place, wherever God would have him to go. And that same concept of looking down the road and trusting God was attributed to Moses, as we see in verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. But the story I want us to study this morning is not that of Noah or Abraham or Moses. It's that of Joseph. He too was able to look down the road, and he teaches us to do the same. Look where we are going. He taught us to see past the problems of life. Our hope is sometimes dimmed by the problems we encounter. We can become so discouraged by a gloomy present that we can't see past it. And we presume that the future is going to be just as dismal as the present is. Do you remember the story of Chicken Little? Maybe you read that story when you were a preschooler, or maybe you have read it to your children. In the story, a little chicken is wandering around the barnyard one day when an acorn falls upon her head. And she jumps to the conclusion that the sky is falling. And she gets all in a panic. And so she runs around the barnyard telling all the other animals, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. They too are caught up in this panic. And they all believe that the sky is falling and some terrible disaster, perhaps the end of the world, is about to come. But one wise animal in the barnyard settled all the rest of them down. It's not that the sky is falling. It's just an acorn. Calm down. It's all going to be okay. The moral to the story is, don't give in to panic. Have the courage to face the unknown and know that it will work out. We have much to be in panic over now, don't we? We're still, many of us, in panic over the coronavirus. It's been going on 4 months now, and many people are still quarantined, still taking extra precautions not to catch the virus. We're worried about where it's going to lead. Is there going to be another spike? What's going to happen next year? Will there be a vaccine? The virus has led to another worry or fear that we have because we've experienced economic decline in our nation. 4 months ago, we were at an economic high. Historically, now we are near a historic low economically. And some businesses have closed. People have lost their jobs, at least temporarily, some permanently. People are affected by the loss of income. And on top of all of that is the civil unrest we are beginning to experience. Rioting and protesting based on racism and anger and maybe even hatred. The world is a mess right now. We wonder if it's ever going to return to normal. We cannot allow current problems to shape our faith. We must look down the road to where we are going. Joseph did that, just like Noah and Abraham and Moses. Let's read Joseph's story in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. What? Gave instructions about his bones. Noah was noted for having a faith large enough to build a big ark to save mankind and the animals. Abraham was noted for having a faith to trust God and sacrifice his son if called upon, feeling that God would raise him from the dead. Moses was noted for having a faith to lead Israel on a miraculous journey to the promised land. And Joseph? Joseph was noted for having a faith to give instructions about his bones. What kind of testimony is that? What is that all about? Let's read the original story as it's found in Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 through 25. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, his great-great-grandsons, in other words. Also, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. Okay, he was 110, so he said it like this. I'm about to die. Or something like that. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. You see, they were stuck in a land that was not their own. They were guests in Egypt, living among a people who were not like them, who did not speak like them, who did not think and have values like them, and many of whom looked upon them with some suspicion and perhaps even racist thoughts because they were not their people. They were interlopers from outside. And so they wondered where this was going to lead. They were stuck in this land that was not theirs. But Joseph taught them to have the faith to look down the road to where they were going and not to focus on their present. And he teaches us also to look past our present predicaments and find strength no matter how difficult times might be, believing that God is in control and we are going to a better place. He teaches us we have a great deliverer. Let's look at verse 24 in Genesis 50 again when Joseph said that. He said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land. God is your deliverer. Joseph had been their deliverer. Do you remember why he was in Egypt? Do you remember that story? When he was a teenager, his brothers, out of jealousy, sold him into slavery. I'm sure you've never experienced any kind of sibling rivalry to that degree, but that's what they did. They sold him into slavery. He ended up in Egypt being a slave for a few years to a military commander. And then, because of a false accusation, he ended up in an Egyptian prison where he spent a few years. He finally caught a break when Pharaoh had a series of troubling dreams, and no one could tell him what they meant. They were repeated over and over. God gave Joseph the ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. They were really a warning from God that there was going to come a time of terrible famine upon the land. And God gave Joseph the wisdom to help Pharaoh devise a plan to spare Egypt from suffering through this famine. Pharaoh was so impressed and so grateful that he elevated Joseph to a high government office. And as a result, when his people came to Egypt, where there was food, looking for help, Joseph was in a position to help them. And so he became the deliverer of two nations, the great nation of Egypt and the fledgling nation of Israel. But now, this deliverer lay dying. He told them, though, look beyond this time. Look down the road to the great deliverer. The next verse 26 in Genesis 50, tells us that Joseph died, and they embalmed him according to Egyptian practices. They mummified him, placed him in a coffin or a sarcophagus. And then shortly afterwards, the father, his grandfather, his adoptive grandfather, who was Pharaoh of the land, also died. And suddenly, the Jewish people no longer had highly favored status in Egypt. We read, for instance, in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, verses 8 and 9, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. And then verse 11 tells us that he made them a slave nation. They built the cities. They built the pyramids. But they were in bondage in the land of Egypt, a land that was not their own. And then 360 years later, when God determined the time was right, he sent deliverance. There's probably been something in your life that has been your deliverance, your go-to when you needed bailed out of something. Maybe it's been some connections you made. You know, some of the right people, and you call in favors from time to time to bail you out. Or maybe it has been a talent that you have. You just have this ability to rise above it all, to pick up the pieces and move on. Or maybe it's been your intelligence, or maybe it's been your wealth, or maybe it's been your charming personality. Whatever it's been that has been your deliverance, I have some bad news for you. That deliverance will not last. It will not deliver you forever. But I also have some good news for you. You don't need that deliverance anyway, for you have a greater deliverer. Look down the road to your deliverance. See past the problems of life. Joseph also teaches us to see past the allure of this world. Our hope is sometimes eclipsed by something that is immediately appealing to us. Joseph certainly was tempted with that. After all, he was vice pharaoh of Egypt. He had great wealth and great prestige. He was the second most powerful man in the most powerful nation in that part of the world. When he died, he would have been buried in a sphinx or a pyramid like all the other great leaders in Egypt, immortalized forever in a gold sarcophagus, except, he said, when you leave this place, take my bones with you. Exodus 13:19 tells us that they took those old dry bones to Israel with them. And he was buried in some obscure place in the mountains. No memorial was erected to him. No plaque marks the spot where his body was buried. His earthly remains were lost forever. And he wouldn't have cared about any of that. For Joseph was looking past it all to where he was going. We must also look past our good fortune, all the treasures and accolades that have come our way, and see where we are going. That's what Jesus taught in Matthew 6, verses 19 and 20, when he said, don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven. Some of us allow present blessings to eclipse future promises. We are distracted by our successes. We are living for the wrong thing. In a previous ministry in the city of Bloomfield, Connecticut, I often would go into the neighborhood surrounding the church building and just knock on one door after another, one up one street and down another. I wanted to meet the people who were the neighbors of our church, introduce myself, find out if there were any spiritual needs that I might meet. I like to strike up conversations with them. I had a few questions that I would ask to try to generate some conversation to get them thinking about spiritual things. One of those questions was, why do you think that people aren't living a faith or attending church like people did in previous generations. One young man in an affluent neighborhood answered my question this way: it's because we're so well off that we don't need God anymore. My jaw dropped, at least on the inside. He wasn't just espousing some theory. He was describing his belief. And it clued me into the way that people think. God is there when we really are desperate and need Him, but most of the time we can take care of ourselves and we don't need God anymore. They're not looking far enough down the road. They're only focused on what is right in front. Dr. Les Parrott is a Christian counselor. He wrote a book entitled "You're Stronger Than You Think." In it, he tells a story about TV actor Ray Romano, who is famous for his lead role in the sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond. That show ran successfully for 9 years and helped Ray Romano become one of the most highly paid TV actors of his time. After the show broadcast its final episode in 2005, Romano went back on stage to speak to the people who had come to be the live audience watching that final filming. He reflected on his past and on his future now that the show was ending. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and unfolded it. He said it was a note that his brother had put in his luggage 9 years ago when he had left New York to find fame and fortune as a Hollywood actor. And he read from the note, saying, "My older brother Richard wrote, 'What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?'" And he folded the note back up, and choking back tears, he said, "Now I'm going to work on my soul." I hope he did. I hope he was able to look down the road to where he was going. That's what we all need to do, to stop and look down the road to where we are going. For we have a greater home than we have here. Did you catch what Hebrews 11 told us that we are in this world? Strangers, foreigners. This world is not our home. Joseph didn't consider this world his home. He didn't consider Egypt his home, which is pretty amazing considering that he lived there for 93 years, most of them in a position of high importance. He knew all the luxuries of living in a royal family. He had enjoyed all the benefits of being a part of the palace, but he was not blinded by his blessings. He knew that a promise from God was of greater value than all the prosperity of the world. And it wasn't that the promised land he looked forward to offered an easier life. The Jewish people would in fact suffer many hardships as they attempted to settle there. But it was God's plan. And Joseph fully trusted God. That's what it means to live by faith. God has a plan for you. He doesn't offer you an easy life. There will be many sacrifices you will be called to make to this life that He beckons you to live. But He does offer a great promise of a glorious, eternal home. You look where you are going and live accordingly. You walk the road of faith toward the greatest destination. And God invites you to take that first step on that journey this morning. If you've never made that commitment of life to follow Him, to begin that journey, He invites you to walk it alongside of Him to a greater place. If you'd like to make that commitment, we invite you to step forward and walk down this aisle and begin your journey with God. Let's stand and sing our closing invitation.